So welcome to the closer look for the 12th of April, 2023. This is China in Latin America 4. We are going to be focusing on Peru and Chile today um, as we go forward with this series. I will remind you that these are the dates and titles for previous closer looks on China and Latin America. We went through a strategic view, Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, and now Peru and Chile. This is one of those series that we are throwing out there for everyone's awareness, situational awareness, strategic awareness, things of that nature. If something pops up that is highly important, we will pause, as we did for the last 2 weeks, um, actually a little bit longer than the last 2 weeks. But we'll pause this series as needed and return to it until we've gone through at least the most significant players in Latin America and their relationship with China. So, welcome to the fourth installment of our series. We are going to start by taking a look at China's relationship with Peru. So, overall relations. Peru was the first Latin American nation to establish relations with China all the way back in 1875. Peru is way ahead of its time in doing this, and most Latin American nations did not acknowledge or trade with China until decades after Peru did. However, it wasn't until 1944 that relations were raised to the embassy level. That only lasted 2 years because of China's civil war. And then, and what they did essentially during that civil war is when Taiwan split off more or less. Peru recognized Taiwan until 1971. So 40s, 50s, 60s, and up to 71, they recognized Taiwan. In 71, they flipped back and recognized the Communist Party in China as a legitimate governing authority. And really, that was about it. Throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, there wasn't really anything of note. They continued to slowly grow closer, trade slowly increased throughout that time, but really not much notable until the 2009 Free Trade Agreement, which is when things really exponentially took off economically. Politically, the recently ousted President Castillo there in Peru was very much in favor of continuing close relations with China. His first visit to an embassy after his election was the Chinese embassy. He was ideologically aligned with the Communist Party there in China. And had intended to greatly expand the relationship. Now, his vice president, Boullarte, who's the current president, is also in favor of cooperation with China. She's not throwing up roadblocks to China. She's not as openly enthusiastic either, and she's extraordinarily bogged down due to domestic concerns, riots, political chaos, things like that. She's also under serious investigation there in Peru due to some of the orders she's put forth for the riots. So she's bogged down, but she's not necessarily against China. So no real threat to trade or relations there at this time, just because of who the president is. Now, economic considerations, as we go through this series on China and Latin America, the economic considerations really come to the forefront because this is how China chooses to lead. China always leads with economic development, investment, things of that nature. So if you've been watching this series with us, these closer looks, um, I'm sure you've picked up on that economic considerations are everything when it comes to how China interacts with the world. So um, both are members of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization. Peru is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, joined that in 2019. They're actually one of the later Latin American nations to join. They have pretty close ties, as I mentioned before, economic ties with China. And it wasn't a matter of being opposed to Belt and Road. It was just a matter of why would we? But in 2019, they changed their mind. Chinese investment, many billions of dollars, primarily focused on mining and energy sectors. And we'll get a little more granular on that here in a moment. But one of the things that they are really laser focused on is the energy sector. So China's Yangtze Power bought U.S. firm Sempra Energy's Peruvian assets for 3.59 billion a couple of years ago, and now owns 83% of Peru's largest power company. Big numbers there, obviously. And then Three Gorges Corp did essentially the same thing, but except they fully bought out a Peruvian company there. So they're really focused on energy production there in Peru. And Peru doesn't appear to be putting up any roadblocks to that. There are many smaller energy providers that have been swept up by Chinese companies. And interestingly enough, when we jump over to Chile here in a bit, same thing's happening there. China-Peru joint venture is constructing a port a little bit north of Lima. This is going to be essentially Peru's largest port when it's done. It will be capable of housing any and all military vessels as well. It is a true deep water port, although just to note, that is not the stated purpose. It could be a purpose for this port of Ashanke being constructed north of Lima. Part of it is open now, and part of it, most of it, is not yet open. China's Costco shipping, and if you want to go down a rabbit hole on Chinese coercion around the world, look into Costco shipping. They're heavily involved with the construction of this particular port, and are expected to use it very heavily once it's completed. Now, the Cayo port down south of Lima, that would be the green. That would be the green marker there from the World Port Source map that I've posted for you to take a look at. That is currently the largest port in Peru, and it is primarily owned by various Chinese firms. So essentially, you're going to have it one north and one south of Lima, mostly controlled by China there in Peru. And so China will be dominant when it comes to shipping and freight in Peru after that happens. A couple of things on exports. So the Chinese exports to Peru are primarily what you see here. These are your top 10: machinery, nuclear reactors. Yes, indeed. You're looking at a lot of electronics. You're looking at a lot of vehicles. You're looking at a lot of consumer electronics, pharmaceuticals, things of that nature. Finished products, more or less, is what China is sending over to Peru. What you're seeing that's a little bit different with Peru is you're seeing a little bit more like iron and steel and plastics going into Peru than you typically see China export. A lot of times you see those materials going into China, not out of China, but that's a slight variation there as compared to other Latin American countries. But robust Chinese exports to Peru, mostly in these kind of these value added segments. Peru going to China. Ores, slag, and ash. Look at that, 14 billion at the top, absolutely decimating all other categories. This is the primary Peruvian export to China: ores, slag, and ash. Peru mines a lot of copper, a lot of various things. They send that to China, and then a lot of times what happens is China makes semi-finished products. They may take the raw ore, for example, make that into vehicle parts or some other item like that, and turn around and send it right back to Peru. But that 14 billion top line number for ore, slag, and ashes, that is Peruvian exports to China. Everything else is very much secondary after that. Taking a look at media influence efforts, we've started adding these into the briefings or the closer looks on China and Latin America, just because a big pillar for China, one of the legs of the stool, if you will, when they go into these countries, is trying to build up rapid media influence efforts. So right now, what we're seeing here is a high influence effort attempt by Beijing, and local resilience is kind of fair, notable, as it's called here. You're not seeing significant pushback, but some, enough is essentially what this is. So Peruvians are more or less sensitive to Chinese influence efforts, but they're certainly not pushing back as strong as, for example, Colombia, which we covered in the last installment of this series, at least per this organization. Now, future considerations. So China is pouring investment in ports, transportation, electrical, and mining infrastructure. They are heavily invested in those segments inside of Peru. They really need that larger port there near Lima to be completed soon in order to continue to mine as much as they want to. They don't want to have to go all the way down to Chile, which Chile has massive ports compared to Peru, far larger than anything Peru has. And so China really needs greater port capability coming out of Peru for an expansion of the relationship. And that is expected to happen over the next several years. Um, Peru right now is very much not focused on foreign policy. They're open to Chinese investment, but again, the domestic issues are really causing a bit of a slowdown, if you will, in Peru's outreaches to China and things like that. There are a lot of deals between China and Peru that are essentially backburnered since Castillo was removed from office and the ensuing domestic unrest. At some point, those will come back to the forefront, but really, Peru needs to fix its own situation at home first before it gets too much more involved with new deals coming out of China. Um, Also, just lastly, for future considerations, moderate odds of security and defense expansion. China does have the ability and has been allowed to send some security forces into Peru in the past, specifically to protect its own assets. Some of the mining operations, the Chinese mining operations, were damaged during some of the recent unrest. Peru has allowed small numbers of Chinese security assets, private security, wink, wink, into the country to protect Chinese assets. So there's a moderate chance that those security and defense operations expand a little bit, especially after current unrest ends. Peru has let some in, but there's no real indication they're going to let very many more in without some sort of formal deal, which they don't have right now. So that's Peru for you. I know that these are fairly quick, 15 minutes on Peru, 15 minutes on Chile coming up, but I do hope that it gives you some good overall awareness of what's going on there, especially if this segment is something that you go back and rewatch, as most folks do, as a recording. Let's look at Chile. So overall relations between China and Chile, 1961 is when trade officially began between the two countries. So well after Peru, if you remember, that was the late 1800s. And trade begins in the 60s. In the 70s, formal relations opened. So Chile became the first South American government to actually recognize China's communist government after the Chinese Civil War happened. A lot of Latin American countries recognized Taiwan after that period of time as the legitimate, or the folks in Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. Not Chile. They went straight into recognizing the communist government in China almost immediately. Through the Pinochet era, they remained very friendly, mostly in the 1980s, 90s, that kind of thing. They have supported each other's claims. As you see here, China supported Chile's claim of sovereignty in the Antarctic. And then in return, Chile let China construct a research station in the Antarctic inside their claimed area. So these two countries have been pretty friendly on the world stage for decades now, more so even than a lot of other Latin American nations with China. Interestingly enough, as close as these relations were, it wasn't until 2006 that a free trade agreement was signed, and then Chile joined Belt and Road in 2018. But on the political side of things, long-standing normal relations, not much strife, not much dissent. The population of Chile is fine with China. They don't really have any you don't see any polls coming out, for example, that show significant pushback from the Chilean people against China authorities, against China's inroad in their country, things of that nature. So it's a pretty close relationship. The government of Chile and the government of China are very, very close, and they're not getting any real significant pushback from the people when it comes to that relationship. So it proceeds. All recent Chilean presidents have traveled to China. Many do so as their first or second trip abroad, showing a heavy emphasis on maintaining a good relationship with China. Out of all the countries in Latin America, Chile is probably in the top 5 or so as far as how friendly are they to China, how accepting are they to Chinese proposals. The interesting thing is the one area where there is not necessarily a close relationship is in military and security agreements. Chile has had a heavy focus on Western military equipment, Western doctrine, Western tactics, and they've built a very capable military, at least as far as regional power is concerned. They've got a pretty robust Navy, Army, and Air Force. Less on the Air Force, but especially the Navy. They're pretty strong. They're pretty capable. That they can certainly hold their own, um, and they greatly prefer Western military equipment over Eastern military equipment. So they really just don't have an incentive to sign any kind of formal security or military cooperation agreements with China, and so they have not. China hasn't necessarily pushed the envelope there either, by the way. Economic considerations, as always, this is a big part of China and how they move into various regions of the world. Chile has more free trade agreements with China and Asia also, so China itself and also Asia as a continent, than any other Latin American nation, and it's not even close. There are hundreds and hundreds of these various agreements that have been signed. Um, China is by and large Chile's number one trading partner. It's not close. And the interesting thing is, as we've been going through this series, primarily what you see is raw commodities, ores, different metals, things like that. Beef, you see a lot of beef and protein out of Brazil. You see a lot of raw materials out of Argentina and Peru, some out of Colombia, things like that. But Chile actually has built a brand for itself inside of China when it comes to berries, grapes, wine, kind of these value added agricultural products. Um, Chilean berries and grapes and wine are highly valued in China. They're seen as luxury items. So for Chile, they have an ever expanding market in those items inside of China, which is quite lucrative for Chile. So that's something very different for that region. You don't typically see goods traveling from Latin America to China that are seen as luxury goods, but Chile is pulling it off. There's a lot of other things too, potassium nitrate, copper, right? Chile sends plenty of commodities and raw materials as well, just like all of the other Latin American nations do. Chinese exports to Chile, value-added goods as well, electronics, cars, communications equipment, and Chile is China's number one export market for electric vehicles. That number one overall, not just in Latin America. They are the number one export market for Chinese electric vehicles in the world. So once again, pretty cozy relationship. And the people of Chile are comfortable enough with China to continue to buy those products at a high rate. Quick note on mining. China does have some very large stakes in Chilean mining companies. You see some here listed on the screen. Obviously, the lithium extraction from the salt flats is a big, big thing for China, but copper is a big thing as well. And China has taken stakes even in some of the Chilean state-owned mining operations, which is very interesting. That shows, again, just how close this relationship is, because with a lot of these countries, you do not see the government allowing a foreign government to take a stake in a state-owned enterprise. That's rare. But in Chile, it seems to be okay. So you see large stakes in these state-owned companies by China. So again, something a little bit different here in this relationship. Infrastructure. Electrical infrastructure is where China, by percentage, has the largest controlling stake. They control 57% of all power distribution in Chile. And these stats, that stat is about 18 months old as well. That's the most recent available, but 57%. And you can see there some of the stakes they have in Transelec and Ataya Energy. I'm not sure I'm getting the pronunciation right. I apologize. And then China's State Grid has acquired some as well. So a lot of the power distribution in Chile is owned by China. Some regions of Chile are 100% controlled from an electrical infrastructure perspective by Chinese companies. And then others are only partially so. So massive potential vulnerability there for Chile, should there ever be issues between them and China, but they don't seem to have an issue with China controlling most of their grid. Also transportation infrastructure. So Chilean Route 5, massive roadway That contract was given to a Chinese company. Line 7 Railroad, same thing. Multiple public hospitals, multiple port upgrades, and new construction. So a lot of transportation infrastructure. Those contracts are given to China. And when I was doing my research on this, it's not that China is necessarily outbidding everyone on these contracts. There are firms out of Japan and South Korea that also bid on a lot of these contracts as well. It's not a matter that of China simply always having the best deal. It's a matter of Chile prefers to work with China. There are multiple cases where other firms from other nations actually provided better deals to China, um, but or excuse me, to Chile, but the authorities in Chile simply were more interested in working with China, which begs the question of why. Is it familiarity, or is there some elite capture going on here, as China is so very, very good at doing? Um, that's a topic for another day. I would say that in my research preparing this briefing, I would say yes, there is. Yes, there is. That a lot of these authorities in Chile certainly appear to prefer China for more than what I would call typical reasons. But that could be an entirely different briefing. We should do a briefing at some point in the future on how China conducts elite capture. That would be fascinating and I think very timely as well. So I'll put that on the list for the future. Um, Huawei and ZTE, very dominant in Chile telecommunications, almost exclusive suppliers there when it comes to telecommunications. Economic considerations, banking and finance, just going along as we usually do. Chile has a very healthy economy. So while they're very close to China in really all aspects outside of the military, they don't really need Chinese lending as much as some of these other countries do. They were later to join Belt and Road. They just don't need major loans like a lot of these other countries do that we've been talking about. There is a currency swap agreement in place. It's authorized up to $8 billion, $8.1 billion actually, but it's very lightly used. Most of the trade between Chile and China is settled in US dollars. There are agreements to settle in local currencies, and it's just not used. These larger companies, they simply want US dollars, as most do around the world. So the currency swap agreement's there, but it's just it might as well not be as far as effectiveness is concerned. Same world port source map that we looked at in Peru. Here's another one for Chile. So if you remember in Peru, they had one port ranked as large and one being built that will be ranked as large. But look at Chile, very large is purple. They have 7 very large ports, and Chile technically has 11 ports that are larger than the largest port up to the north there in Peru. So Chilean ports are massive. They are highly capable. They more or less control the southern half of South America when it comes to port activity. Anything coming out of China is almost certain to go in through Chile if it's eventually bound for Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, even southern Brazil. So massive amounts of ports in Chile and very large ones as well. China's invested in many of these, but it's primarily investment in, not full control of, as opposed to Peru, where there are essentially Peru's 2 largest ports that China is poised to take full control of. That's not really the situation in Chile. Their ports are very spread out. There's a heavy distribution and quite a lot of capability there, especially in the northern part of the country, as you can see on this world port source map. China exports to Chile, mostly electronics, electrical equipment, things like that, nuclear reactors, apparel, blah, blah, blah. Pretty similar here to what you see Chinese exports to all of the Latin American countries, finished value added type materials. Nothing in particular stands out on that. Chilean exports to China, bam, same type thing as Peru, ore, slag, and ash, dominant, but they also have heavy copper and inorganic chemicals, etc., going into China. You are seeing some other things, edibles, meat and fish and crustaceans and things like that. The edible fruits, nuts, peels of citrus fruit, melons, those are seen as luxury items inside of China coming out of Chile. And then when I mentioned the wines and the berries and things like that that are seen as luxuries, that is actually just outside the top 10, down around 12 or so. That's a very growing market, though, for Chile, and something that's a little bit interesting. Media influence efforts, high attempts by China in Chile, high resilience by the people. Resilience and response, as you see there, is ranked as high. At the same time, um, there may be high resilience to Chinese messaging, but it's also a almost neighborly friendly relationship. This is not necessarily confrontational, like it is, for example, in Colombia. When we looked at Colombia previously, the resilience and response was also ranked as high, but it was a lot more hostile than what you typically see coming out of Chile. So future considerations, and then we will conclude. China is absolutely just guaranteed to retain its strong economic grip in Chile. There are no indicators that the economic relationship is going to change at any time in the near future, nor are there any indications that Chile is going to cease importing Chinese tech. Like I said, communications equipment in Chile is absolutely dominated by Chinese companies. Chile is okay with that. Chile likes to import those items and continues to do so. Um, and then Chile likely to avoid military cooperation. They've invested so many billions of dollars at this point in Western equipment, strategies, tactics, et cetera, that they simply have no real motivation to switch over to Chinese made or even Russian made equipment. Um, and just as their capabilities grow, with their navy specifically, they just don't have a lot of reason to coordinate with China on these things, unlike some other countries. So continued heavy involvement in all non-military aspects is absolutely something that we should expect out of Chile. You could almost call Chile China South at this point, outside of the military aspect. So all indicators from our research this past week seem to indicate that that's likely to continue. Glancing at the chat functionality, I don't see any Q&A coming through from the subscribers. So once again, here's how you reach out to us for this global hotspot briefing for the 12th of April. We appreciate you. Thank you for being here. And as always, we will see you next week. Thanks, everyone.